And we are live. Welcome to Literary Salon, Learning Prose from the Prose. I'm Marla Miller from marlamiller.com, and this is our second episode. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Jane Smiley, Pulitzer Prize winning author, with us for this second episode of Literary Salon. Jane Smiley, welcome to our show.
Thank you.
I'm just delighted to have you. Okay. I want to read just a very short blurb for those listeners out there who don't know who don't have a sense of your background. I don't know who wouldn't by now, but there are probably a few. Let me read this. Jane Smiley is a novelist and essayist. Her novel, 1,000 Acres, won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award in 1992. And her novel, The All-True Travels and Adventures of Liddy Newton, won the 1999 Spur Award for Best Novel of the West. She has been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters since 1987. Her novel, Horse Heaven, was shortlisted for the Orange Prize in 2002. And her latest novel, Private Life, was chosen as one of the best books of 2010 by The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and The Washington Post. I could go on and on, but I want to include this. In addition, you've written for many magazines, including Playboy. In addition to novels for adults, she has written several works of nonfiction, including 13 Ways of Looking at a Novel, A History and Anatomy of the Novel as a Form, and The Man Who Invented the Computer, an account of the complex and sometimes amazing circumstances that led to one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. She also has published 4 volumes of her horse series for young adults, and I hope that we touch upon just a little bit because
Five volumes.
Five, and I know that your latest novel is not out yet. It's coming out October 2014. And Jane, would you give us the title of that novel?
It's called Some Luck.
Some Luck, and I have that on marlamiller.com already. I have the book jacket on there, but that's coming out in October. And so what I want to talk to you about, Jane Smiley, of course I want to talk to you about a lot of stuff, but could we start at the beginning, your salad days, when you discovered, I know that you, in your biographical material, said that you kind of knew you wanted to be a writer at the age of like 12, but take us from that to your first novel, which was published, I believe, in 1980. What was that young writer? Give us a taste of Jane Smiley back then, if you would.
Well, first of all, I didn't want to be a writer when I was 12. I wanted to be a jockey.
Oh, you did? Okay, sorry. Never mind.
Evidence that wasn't going to happen as I got taller.
Because you're really tall. You know, I should tell people that I met you first at the Santa Barbara Writers Conference in 1992 when you were keynoting there. You will be again keynoting at the Santa Barbara Writers Conference in just about 4 weeks from now. I met you and I gushed all over you then, but you probably don't remember. And two things that you know, as I sat in the audience listening to you talk about 1,000 Acres, I realized, boy, you were tall, because I'm tall, and also funny. And I don't know why I thought someone who wrote as well as you wrote shouldn't be so funny, but you had a marvelous sense of humor, and we were all very engaged, and I look forward to your keynoting in a couple of weeks here in Santa Barbara. So, but here's where I was confused. You come from a family of storytellers, yes?
Yes, they told gossip. You know, they were gossipers.
Me too.
The stories that they told were about themselves, and you know, the early life of the family. My grandparents met in Idaho, moved to Texas, came to Missouri. They had quite a sort of bouncing around career all through the early 1900s and into the 1920s, and we thought this was very great adventure. Nobody ever told us that this is because my grandfather couldn't hold a job or something like that. You know, it never seemed bad. It always seemed like an adventure because they made it sound funny and exciting. And the other thing that I think was important was once somebody would tell you a story, like Aunt Ruth would tell you a story, then somebody else, like Aunt Jane, would take you aside and tell you the real version of that story. And
Indeed.
so there were a lot of different versions, and a lot of them were very funny and insightful. And they never talked about other things. They never talked about religion. They never talked about race. They never talked about politics very much, unless it entered into some story. My grandfather was one of 10 children,
Wow.
and so there were stories to be told about all kinds of people on his side of the family. And so I think that's the best way for a novelist to grow up, actually.
Because you developed a storytelling ear.
Yeah. That's what I thought was the most fun. When my cousins would come from Chicago or Amarillo, and we would run and get the box of pictures from the old days and get them to talk, and that was always fun.
But at age 12, you were hoping to be a jockey, and so
I was. Yeah,
was that before your growth spurt?
Oh yeah, at age 12 I was about 5'1", and I was very obsessed with horses and was taking riding lessons, and but I loved to read books. That was my favorite other thing to do besides ride horses, was to read books. And I read all through childhood. I think reading is the other essential thing that novelists must do, because if you read enough, then in some ways the next step is, oh, I could do that.
I could do that, or I could try to do that.
Yeah, or I could try to do that. And then the most important thing, I think, for an aspiring novelist is just to be fascinated by the aspect of trying to do it, so that you don't step back and look at it and say, oh, this is awful, this is crap. You just step back and look at it and say, oh, this is really interesting. You just can't stop yourself from wanting to keep at it. And there's a pleasure in, it's not exactly expressing yourself, but in telling that story and in making that story something that you would like to read.
Along those lines, Jane, I've heard from several noted storytellers like yourself that really novel writing is a way for people for some writers to kind of work out issues, or to understand something that they don't know, or want to make sense of something that's just doesn't make any sense. And thematically, would you say that is something that where does the kernel of your stories start? Do they start from a theme that it's bothering you? Does a character pop in your head first and say, I demand that you tell my story? Your process a little bit, if you don't mind.
It just varies from to novel. Sometimes it's a character. Sometimes, for example, in Private Life, I was interested in the character of Andrew, who's a very eccentric guy, and his wife is very normal. I was interested in how they would interact over the years. But other times it's something else. For example, in Moo, which takes place at a land-grant university, I was just interested in the idea of the land-grant university and how it was a real spur to creativity in all kinds of technical fields, including the invention of the computer, but other things too. And yet, it does seem to be a little set off from the rest of the world. So simultaneously, it's apart from the world and influencing the world in an enormous way. And I thought that was interesting. So that was why I got interested in that. When I did the All True Travels and Adventures of Liddy Newton, that grew out of being in Washington, D.C. When the bombing took place in Texas, the big Texas bombing, and calling because my daughter was with me, and so we called her dad to tell her that we were okay, and I said, boy, I really need to write something about this kind of internal conflict between the right and the left, and the first thing out of his mouth was Kansas before the Civil War. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting, because I grew up in St. Louis. So I was a little bit familiar with it, but then the more that I learned about it, I thought, oh, those 4 years before the Civil War were really, really interesting and very similar to what was going on at the time, which was happening in Bosnia and Croatia. So it's all different. It's different things. You know, when I was in Iceland, someone told me that in Greenland you could fall out of your boat and freeze to death in 5 minutes, and I thought, oh wow! And then there was this whole colony of people that lived on Greenland. So it's more about curiosity than it is about working out inner problems. It's more about.
I was just going to say that, yeah, for you. But you're also a student of or at least you seem to be, because now I know you through social media a bit, and you are a woman with a great conscience, and you have some issues that are really very, very close to your heart, and I think that you do explore them in your essays and it seems to me anyway that you do, and I have to throw Ray Bradbury in here, because I remember when I was listening to you at the doing your keynote in in 1992. You know, at that time, Ray Bradbury always opened the Santa Barbara Writers Conference, and he pretty much said the same thing every year, but when Ray Bradbury said it, you didn't mind listening to it over and over. And one of the things that he told us is that you must, if you're really serious about writing, you must write all forms. You must write poems. You must write essays, letters to the editors. You must write fan letters to famous authors. You must write novels. You must write nonfiction, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember when I was, looking at your bio, sitting in the audience and wanting so much to be better at craft, saying to myself, well, she's doing all this. Oh, so she's doing it. No wonder why she's standing up there. So you've just always written, yes, in several forms, fiction, nonfiction.
I prefer writing novels, but I think nonfiction is lots of fun, and so I've written several books of nonfiction. I blogged on the Huffington Post for a while.
I saw that, yeah.
And I wrote a lot of letters to the editor to the New York Times. What can I say? I just like to express myself in writing.
Absolutely. Because you're a writer.
I live off in the corner. I live in Carmel Valley up on a hillside, and I'm not really in any kind of social group. So it's, so those of us who are living off in the corner, we have to send letters. So that's what we do.
Jane, I want to talk just a little bit, because we have a lot of listeners here who are relatively new to the writing business. And since your first novel was published in 1980 and you got the Pulitzer in 1992, after that first novel was published, do you remember how you felt? Did you feel like, I've arrived, or, oh my God, nobody's buying these books, or any sense of what you felt in those early days? Share with us, if you would.
Well, we were lucky in those days, because you could you could just enter by the back door. And I always think of my first 3 books as practice novels. So I got a little bit, I got a few reviews and a little bit of money, and I got to just practice and decide what I wanted to do. And I'm very glad in retrospect that none of them made a big splash, that they mostly resulted in a nice little pat on the head,
But enough to keep you going, yes?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I never looked at it as, a disappointment or anything. I looked at it as, that's good, so let's go.
Keep moving forward, yeah.
I think that kind of, well, first of all, I think you need to be more interested in what you're doing and how to do it than in the results. Because if you're focused on the results, your life is going to be a tragedy, because the results will never be enough. And however great the result is, you will lose the sense of that wondrousness after about 3 days.
So important for people to hear this.
But if you really like what you're doing, you just do it day after day, because it's interesting and you want to do it and you can't stop and you're pretty fascinated. And I've had books that were easy to write and I thought that was a pleasure. I've had books that were hard to write and I was frustrated, but there was a pleasure in other ways, namely the pleasure of keeping trying to figure out, it's a kind of intellectual pleasure. So I think my start was A1. I liked it.
And you've been with Random House, yes, and you're a
Yeah.
Knopf writer. You've been with Random House forever, right?
Since the third novel, Duplicate Keys, that was sold to Knopf. I started out, and my best friend in the writer's workshop went on to be an editor. And she was my editor for the first 2 books. And then for the third book, her boss wouldn't buy it, so that was a big disappointment. But then I moved on to Random House, which was the bonus. I moved down to Knopf, which was the bonus.
Knopf is the bonus. Knopf is the prize as far as, yeah.
Even then, my editor was my age. I mean, I think that's another interesting thing.
Talk a little bit about that, yeah.
When you're starting out, the group you want to impress are the people your own age. The people who are a generation older than you might come along and want to, bring you into the fold and make you a big star and blah 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 blah. But they're old. The people
Yeah.
who are your peers are the people who should be your readers. And I think it's a good thing to just make your way along with your generation as you get older. At least that's been good for me.
Can we fast forward a little bit from your beginnings to when you wrote 1,000 Acres and then you got the Pulitzer? Now, 1,000 Acres is, talk a little bit about that's really based on Shakespeare's King Lear, yes?
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit. Could you talk a little bit about that? Where did it come?
I'd always had to read King Lear all through high school,
yes.
all through college, and I always thought that those 2 girls, Goneril and Regan, got the short end of the stick. I didn't understand why they were so maligned by the critics and my teachers and whatever. Because I guess deep down I didn't have a lot of sympathy for King Lear. He just talked all the time. He was complaining all the time, and it was his idea to give the kingdom away. So why couldn't he just stick with it? I just,
Yeah.
But
yeah, sure.
He acted much. He acted much more unpleasantly than anybody I knew in my family. So I didn't have a lot of sympathy with him. And I thought it would be fun to write a novel from the daughter's point of view. And I thought that for a long time. And then one day I was living in Ames, Iowa, and we were driving south from Minneapolis, and it was late winter, and the landscape was very flat, and the weather was very austere and dark. And I thought, oh, I should set that King Lear novel here. And
you did. You just went, oh, perfect place to set it. Okay.
Good place to set it.
Yeah.
Partly because the landscape is very strange and mysterious. It's very fertile, and the history of farming in that area is quite interesting. And so that was, that's how it came to me. And then I sat down and I read the play 5 times, and I came up with the names, and I just sort of went on my way. I tried to adhere to the play as closely as I could without there being a war, because I did acknowledge that we were living in the 20th century now. So that's how I went about it.
And when you were notified of the Pulitzer, because of course every writer out here wants to know what that phone call is like, do you remember? I'm sure you remember it. What was your reaction?
Well, the person who notified me wasn't a Pulitzer person. It was a person from the Ames Tribune.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
She didn't say you won a Pulitzer. She said, or he, I can't remember if it was a man or a woman. She said, what would you say if you won a Pulitzer? And I said, oh, I don't think I've won a Pulitzer. And they said, well, what would you say? I said, I don't think so. I said, so if you had won a Pulitzer, what do you think you would say?
Seriously?
So I said something, and then I hung the phone up. My daughter was 14, and she was home from school, And I sat down at the table with her, and I said, I think I won a Pulitzer. And she went, ah, cool.
As only 14-year-olds can say.
And then I went to do my job. I went to school, and I was sitting in my office. And around 2:30, the phone started ringing. And as I was answering phone calls, I heard somebody running down the corridor and then suddenly screaming. And I looked out of the door, and it was the Ames correspondent for the Des Moines Register looking at her Ames Tribune and realizing she had been scooped by the Ames Tribune. Those were the people that had called me that morning. And it turned out that the guy who owned the Ames Tribune, the newspaper, happened to have been running the Pulitzer board. So he knew what was going on.
Little inside track there.
So obviously his first thought was to scoop the Des Moines Register.
Got it. Boy, those reporters. Always thinking about themselves, huh? Were you thrilled? Were you thrilled? Were you just beyond?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was very, very exciting. But on
Sure.
the other hand, I was about 4 months pregnant, so I couldn't do much. You know, it's like I was talking to Michael Cunningham about winning the Pulitzer, and he immediately started going around the world doing lots of things, you know, invitations and
Of course.
But I couldn't do that. So
you were nursing a newborn.
Well, I was 4 months pregnant, you know.
Yeah, and get ready.
So mostly I just received the flowers and then went back to work. I was writing Moose, so I just got back to work.
How many books? We're going to end this because you have. I can't thank you enough for taking your time to talk to Literary Salon. It's been lovely. However, I would love for you to, and I'm going to do this with all of our authors. I'm hoping to end each show with talking a little bit about craft that you do well, and perhaps reading just a little bit of it for our listeners. Because when you have the opportunity to talk to writers who have, you know, really received the esteem that you have and have earned your writing chops, that's for sure. I like writers to hear what these authors have written, and so could you talk a little bit about a craft technique that you do and perhaps read a little something?
Well, I think one of the things that I do is communicate feeling through image.
Good. Good.
And so I just sort of opened private life without even trying to. And maybe this is a little sad, this paragraph, but...
Jane, before you read that, is it fair to say that private life is about a loveless marriage? I mean, essentially.
Yes, but it's also an old-fashioned style of marriage.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, sure.
It's not a marriage based on attraction. It's a marriage based on...
practicality.
I'm not going to say on practicalities.
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
And it's a long marriage too. And in the course of the marriage, they do have Margaret first has a miscarriage, and then she has a baby, and the baby has that syndrome where the mother's blood is O negative and the father's
Rh negative.
Rh. So she has Rh syndrome.
Got it.
Or he does, excuse me. On the morning of the 18th day, she unwrapped him and saw that his belly was hugely distended. She saw, moreover, that it had been hugely distended, but that she hadn't recognized it as hugely distended. She had only recognized it as Alexander. Alarm and guilt surged in her, burning upward from her feet, enveloping her head, her brain, her mind in a fever of knowledge. The first thought was not to call Dr. Bernstein at all, but to hide this development from him, and for some reason call Mrs. Kimura. Even as she thought this, Alexander started to make a noise, high-pitched and distressed, to arch his back. It seemed to her that he was crying for help, so she picked him up and went to the door of the room and opened it. Naoko was in the hallway. She looked at her, and without Margaret saying anything, the girl ran out the front door. Margaret closed her door and carried Alexander over to the bed. She sat down and readied herself to nurse, but in that short moment, the moment between her sitting down and her putting him to the breast, he lost even that ability. Margaret felt it. It was a feeling of something dissolving. She looked at his face. She saw that he had but one thing left, which was that he could look back at her. She stroked the top of his head, moving the thin hairs this way and that, feeling the smoothness of his golden skin. She held him closer as gently as she could. And then, in the way that you can feel with your baby but not see or sense with anyone else larger or more distantly related, she felt the life force go out of him entirely.
Aww.
That's a sad one. This is a novel based on a great...
You got me on that, Jane.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
You're right. That was sad. Yeah.
This is a novel that was based on the life of a relative of mine. Yeah. And we do have that Rh negative problem in our family. So do we. And so she didn't have any children, and that's what I assume was the reason. So.
And you know what I loved about that passage was that, you know, you never really talked about she was sad, she was angry, she was frustrated, none of it. It all came through the touch of that baby. We knew just how she was feeling.
Good.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
That is definitely a literary skill that takes a while to develop, and I really appreciate you sharing that with our listeners. I'm not going to take up any more of your time, but I must ask you one last question. Okay. Do you have any idea what you might be talking about in your keynote at the upcoming Santa Barbara Writers Conference?
No.
That's okay. We'll be in the audience waiting for you to say whatever it is that you want to say. Will the new book be out? Will we be able to buy it then? Or I know we can pre-order it now, and I've got that on my website.
Oh, no, it's not out till October, the new book.
But we can pre-order.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And then one last thing before we go, and let me just see if I can share this, because I would like to. This is your book on craft. And here is your, I hope that we're going to see it. I think we will. This is, can you see that, Jane?
Oh, yeah, 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. Yeah.
Yes. Now, I'm just going to put this up. This is on Random House. So for listeners, you can go to janesmiley.com. She has a website there. But this one at Random House, I think, is really chock full of good stuff, including 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel that you penned right after 9/11, or a couple of years. Would you just end with that little story about what happened at 9/11 and where you went after that tragedy hit our country? In your mind, what that did for you?
Well, I think it did the same thing for me that it did for a lot of writers. We suddenly felt that whatever it was we were working on at that moment was worthless. And so what I did was to go into my bedroom and read a book that was the farthest away from right now as I could find, and that was The Tale of Genji. Excuse me. Which was written about 1,000 years ago, and yet the steady theme of The Tale of Genji is the ephemerality of life. And so I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So then I read some other really, really old books, and they were all very relevant to what we were thinking and doing, each in a different way. So after I'd read about 4 of them, maybe I got through the Decameron and the Heptameron, I thought, this is really interesting that these books have so much more in common than I thought they would. And so I think I'll write a book about how novels sort of are all of a piece and yet very different from one another. So that's why I wrote 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. There are 2 chapters in it, one called A Novel of Your Own Part 1, one called A Novel of Your Own Part 2. Those are about writing novels, and people have found them quite useful. But I read lots of novels, including all of Proust. And
did you?
I did. I may be
Wow.
the only person in America who.
I think so.
And it was a great joy and pleasure to read all those books and to write about them. And I truly enjoyed writing this book, and I think that my pleasure comes through in it. Yeah.
Well, in addition to encouraging listeners to purchase Jane Smiley's books, if you're really wanting to be serious about learning the craft of novel writing, you must purchase 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. I just did. I didn't know it was out here, Jane, so I will now use it in my workshops because I found it very, very helpful. In fact, it reminds me of Barney Conrad's book that he wrote, First Opening Scenes. And there's like 1,000 opening scenes of great, great novels. And this is along that line in terms of how you develop this book on the page. And I think it's a must-read for anyone who wants to learn how to write a novel.
Yes, thank you. I think that I enjoy dipping into it myself. I look at it and go, hi.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's filled with good stuff. Jane, I'm not going to take up any more of your time. I just want to thank you again for giving your time to Literary Salon, learning prose from the prose. And if we haven't learned something from Jane Smiley, then there's something wrong because you are just a treasure trove of information. And I really hope that people, before they push that publish button, they just do their due diligence on their novels. And if you're looking for role models, writers, Jane Smiley is definitely one. Until the next time, listeners, be well, keep writing, and tune in to our next episode, episode 3 of Literary Salon, Learning Prose from the Prose. Caitlin Rother, who also will be appearing at the Santa Barbara Writers Conference, will be our next guest. Jane Smiley, again, my heartfelt thanks.
Anytime.
Thanks.